Yeah, welcome back to Veritas. I'm here with John Lash. This is Mel Fabregas. And before the break, we were talking about the current events around the world and what has happened ever since the Dark Ages. But there's obviously some positives, something that Gnosticism can do to improve the way we live. John.
Certainly. One of the things that I set myself to do when I began to dig into these Gnostic materials was to find out what is really the message here. You know, what is the message? What is it that the Gnostics knew? What is it that they taught? And first of all, why was it so threatening to early Christians? Well, we've kind of covered that part of it. It's not because Gnostics, being pagans, hated Christians. Christians are just people. I don't hate Christians. It's a matter of warning the world about the belief system that Christians adopted. It's about the belief system, not about the people. And so we can see that there was a threat, and that threat had to be eliminated in order for the belief system to be imposed. But behind all that, the Gnostic message is still there, and I reconstructed it in my book. And to introduce what the Gnostic message is, I'd like to just spin around the corner for a moment and say something about my experience as a mythologist, if I might.
Of course.
You know, I'm a self-taught mythologist. I mean, people connect me with Mircea Eliade and Joseph Campbell, and that's very flattering because they were really big, you know, celebrities in the world. But I'm just a self-taught mythologist, and yet I have covered the same material that they covered. So I know what they know, and I have built on what they did. And Campbell and Eliade were both comparative mythologists, and that's relatively rare. At any time, I would say there can't be more than half a dozen or maybe 10 comparative mythologists on the planet. It's a very rare vocation. Most people who study mythology in order to teach it in the university or write about it will concentrate on one particular subject, like Greek mythology or Native American or Aztecs or Eskimo mythology, whatever. A comparative mythologist like myself looks at myths from all the cultures and ages of the world. Polynesia, China, Siberia, Greece, Rome, Ireland, South America. Look at all of the mythologies and compare them. I have to tell you something that happened to me in the course of my life. In the process of doing this, naturally, I have explored hundreds, probably thousands of myths. But let's say 200 or so myths that I've looked at very, very closely from all these different cultures. And I've compared the characters in them and compared the themes. So I've had a chance through my entire life to make what you could call a really thorough inventory of the myths in the world. And I find that there is, of course, much truth in these myths. They're not just fictions or fabrications, but they are stories that teach us how to live. And they contain and are often coded with very powerful information. But I would say that the most amazing experience that I've had in this field is the discovery of one myth that is completely incomparable. There is no other myth that comes close to it. It's unique, it's coherent, it's cogent, and it is, as far as I know, the only complete planetary myth that our species has produced. The only complete planetary myth. I want you to know what I mean by that. If you go into any area of mythology, for instance, Japanese mythology or Polynesian or Greek mythology, you will find creation myths because all of these cultures describe the creation of the world. So there are many, many creation myths of different kinds, but there is only one complete creation myth that describes the origin of the planet Earth. And that is really amazing. I don't know if I can impress upon you how amazing that is. It's certainly for me, it was a revelation. And where did I find that myth? I found it in these repressed Gnostic writings. And that is the myth of the fallen goddess.
Would you say that you are demythologizing history?
I would say that I don't know exactly what you mean by that. As a mythologist, I look at the way that history has been told, and yes, I want to remove from history some of the mythology that has been attached to it.
Exactly.
That I would consider to be toxic or delusional. But the amazing thing is, there is this unique myth of I call it the fallen goddess scenario, and it was the center piece of the whole movement of Gnosticism. And this myth has a story that explains the origin of the human species, the origin of our planet, the nature and presence of the divine intelligence of our planet, the presence of extraterrestrial predators upon humanity, the origin of those predators, the nature of their behavior, their description, and their intentions toward humanity. And the myth also explains the special relation of humanity to the planet Earth, to the Earth goddess, whose name is Sophia. So whereas you might find in other cultures, in other origin myths, fragments and hints of these factors in the scenario, in the Gnostic myth of the fallen Sophia, you have the entire story intact. And there's nothing like it that I have ever seen. So I would say that in my experience as a comparative mythologist, this is the most amazing thing I have ever seen.
And I know you want to focus on the positive aspects of Gnosticism, but I also want to continue giving the audience a little bit of a background.
Sure.
Right now we have censorship in the media. We know that. There are a few shows like ours that we're able to do what we have to do unfiltered. But the time may come where we maybe have to be licensed in order to be able to operate.
Have an internet site.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
So I really don't see any difference between the Romans, the conquistadors, and other invasions or certain revolutions. In order to conquer people, you have to get rid of their intellectuals and destroy their cultural knowledge. Do you see that happening today?
Precisely. That is what is happening today is the last chapter of what we saw with the death of Hypatia. The way to destroy a culture is to destroy the intellectuals. That means the people who carry the intelligence of that culture, the teachers of that culture, the people who teach the members of the culture to think for themselves, to be responsible and reasonable, to question authority. The way you control and overcome a society is by destroying those people and censoring what they have to say. And that's what was done with the Gnostics. But fortunately, for some reason, these books that were found in the desert in Egypt in 1945 survived. And they're very fragmentary and chaotic. In fact, they're a terrible mess. I talk about that in the book. I explain the Nag Hammadi codices are a mess. But it's sort of like Mel, I often compare it to a handful of fragments of a great, beautiful mosaic. And you have to construct the picture that was in the mosaic from this handful of fragments because somebody blew the mosaic up, you see? But it can be done. And when it's done, we get this fantastic vision story. I believe that this vision story is unique, and that is the story that is able to guide our species toward its proper role in evolution, toward its proper role and its proper place in the cosmos. And no other story can do that like this particular story.
And you talk about the Nag Hammadi, we can think of the Sumerian tablets, but John, I think of where we store our knowledge today. Computer hard drives, silicon chips, CDs, DVDs, etc. Not a very reliable way to preserve our knowledge in the event of a natural disaster or man-made catastrophe. Don't you think? And how would you deal with this if something were to happen? How would you preserve our knowledge today?
Well, the way that the Gnostics preserved the knowledge that they had of this divine being, Sophia. One thing I would like to say, though, in regard to Gnostics, before we continue, is a little point of correction that's actually quite important. And I make this point in my book. The people that we're talking about, these Gnostics, actually never used that word to describe themselves. So we're calling them by a name that they did not call themselves. In fact, the word Gnostic, I don't know if you came across this passage in the book yet, Mel, but the word Gnostic is really meant as an insult. It literally means a knower, but to the people who used it, it means a know-it-all or smartass. Oh, those Gnostics, meaning those know-it-alls, those smartasses. That's how actually it was used by the early Christian ideologues and church fathers. When the Gnostics came out and confronted them about their belief system, said, hey, we don't think that this idea of a redeemer coming from the supernatural Father to save us is really a good idea. We think it's wrong. We think it's delusional. And we've had a pretty long experience in spiritual practices, and the early Christians turned around and said, oh, you know it all, you smart ass. Don't think you can tell us what to believe in. You see? It was an insult. And it's really important today, if we want to recapture the spirit of the Gnostics, is to know what they called themselves. And they called themselves telestai, Telestai. And that is from the Greek root telos, meaning aim or purpose. And what telestai means is such a beautiful word. It means those who are aimed. We are aimed, like an arrow is aimed. So the Gnostics called themselves, they accepted that label, but it's a kind of a derogatory label. They called themselves telestai because they all shared a common vision, and that vision is what aimed them. In other words, their practice of spirituality, if you will, and their practices in life as teachers and guides to the world was all based on how they were aimed, how they were directed by this story. So this story, which I reconstructed from the Nag Hammadi materials, is really the secret and the essence of the Gnostic vision of life. Story of the fallen goddess, Sophia.
Is Sophia equal Gaia, the living planet?
Yes, Sophia is, what they call Sophia is what we would today call Gaia. So I have kind of coined this term, Gaia Sophia, to put those two together. And what the Gnostics meant by Sophia is very, very simple. It's the name of a feminine energy, if you want to call it that, a powerful feminine energy, goddess energy, that actually had its home, you could say, in the center of our galaxy. This is very, very source-specific information, Mel. The Gnostic fallen Sophia story is specifically about the planet Earth and the galaxy that we are in. So most people know that we are now in a 4 or 5-armed lenticular spiral galaxy with a population of about 200 billion suns circulating in the arms of the galaxy. Most people also know that the core of the galaxy, or the hub, is a pure mass of molten white light. And then the arms of the galaxy are like pinwheel formations spiraling around that core. The Gnostic vision story is about what happened in our galaxy. It's about a force that originates in the center and that burst out of the center of the galaxy and flowed into the spiraling arms and eventually formed itself into a planet. So the name Sophia is the name that the Gnostics gave to our planet before it actually became a planet. It is the name of the energy that formed our planet. And that energy is metaphorically or mythologically described as a goddess force, Sophia, which means wisdom. The word Sophia means wisdom.
I'm even surprised that this knowledge was able to be preserved with the amount of crimes that were committed against the Gnostics and those who were pagans. But can we categorically say, and not to undermine the loss of life and the crimes,
sure,
that the best example of intellectual cleansing was the burning of the Library of Alexandria?
The burning of the Library of Alexandria and the destruction of hundreds of other similar libraries, and the centuries-long campaign to destroy every single scroll and document that came from the mystery schools, which were the spiritual universities led by the Gnostics, was intentional, and it was done to eliminate that knowledge, because if that knowledge were allowed to coexist with the belief system of Christianity, people would not have chosen Christianity. They would have chosen the other way, because it's more sane, you see. So the option had to be eliminated. At the moment that the belief system of Christianity was put out, people were not allowed to think otherwise. The destruction of pagan intellectual and spiritual culture is the greatest act of genocide, of intellectual genocide that's ever happened in history. And it went on for centuries.
When I come back to 1,000 years later, a parallel drama played out. You said that Indians were robbed and murdered at pleasure because the Christians, whites, were not held accountable for the abuse of non-Christians. Isn't this happening today with other religions too?
Certainly it is. Said religion, as it calls itself, is something you've got to put into question. You have to ask yourself, well, what is religion? If religion is a teaching, a program that gives a person an opportunity or option to follow their spiritual life, then that's fine. But if religion is a pretext to murder, destroy, rape, and control other people, what kind of religion is that? And unfortunately, that's pretty much what religion is about. You know, don't even have to mention the word Zionism. Don't even have to mention the word Israel, where all this began, by the way, because the Redeemer complex came out of Palestine. It was a virus. It was a delusional virus that came out of Palestine, as I explained in my book. And it came out of the region of the Dead Sea Scrolls and out of that culture. So certainly it just takes a little common sense to say that if religion is a practice of goodness and coexistence and love, how can it possibly support and endorse these behaviors, this thing?
Absolutely. And just a quick parenthesis here. If the Romans proceeded with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, how did the whole Roman Empire merge into the Catholic Church?
Well, it's very easy. You just go look at the Emperor Constantine. He's the one who made the marriage pact. He made Christianity state religion. And why did he do that? Because the Roman Empire was falling apart, and it had lost it had become destabilized. It was purely political. Christianity is just it's just politics. It's just used for political reasons, just the same way as the state of Israel is used for political reasons. It doesn't have anything to do with the religion, true religion of the Hebrews, whatever that was. So Constantine just said, wow, I need a solution here. My authority as a Roman emperor is in question. Aha! This new belief system of Christianity claims the authority of a spiritual Father God beyond the earth. No one can question the authority of this Father God. Well, I'll just say that my authority and his are the same.
I love it how you connect the dots, John. But one synchronistic event that caught my eye while reading your book, Not in His Image, was since you mentioned Israel, was the one that the first 7 Dead Sea Scrolls texts found were identified by scholars at the very moment when the United Nations voted to form the State of Israel in November of 1947.
Absolutely mind-boggling.
And what did it say? Behold, my people, I mean to raise you from your graves and lead you back to the soil of Israel. How coincidental can that be?
That's right. That ain't no coincidence, or that's a cosmic coincidence. Right. I want to point out, by the way, and I think this will be helpful to people coming toward this material, because this is really dense and difficult material. I'll tell you, sorting this stuff out has been hard, and I hope I've done a pretty good job of it. But one thing that you need to understand is that the Nag Hammadi texts, which preserve Gnostic teachings, or the teachings of the Telestai, were found in Egypt in 1945, and they're written in Coptic. Don't confuse them with the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were found in Israel in 1947, and they were written in ancient Hebrew and Aramaic and a couple of other obscure languages. And so the Dead Sea Scrolls don't have anything to do with the Gnostics and the Telestai of paganism. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the documents of a sect of very radical, xenophobic, militaristic Jews who lived near Jerusalem in the first centuries of the Christian era. And the interesting thing, Mel, is that actually there are some references in the Nag Hammadi writings to that cult. There are some interconnections between the Dead Sea material and the Nag Hammadi material, and I've developed them in my book. But even more interesting than that, I believe, is that there is a connection between the Nag Hammadi Gnostic materials and the Sumerian Anunnaki material.
Huh.
That's really interesting.
Yes.
And that's probably the deal breaker for our species. I'm getting the feeling lately that Sumerian Anunnaki script is the deal breaker for our species. Where you stand on that story is pretty much where you stand on your own humanity. So be very careful about looking at that story.
How much credence do you give to that and to the Zecharia Sitchin's work?
Well, let me ask you this. You told me that you did the last interview with Zecharia Sitchin, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm sure that other people that you've interviewed have talked about the Anunnaki script, the Anunnaki story.
Yes.
Which is basically, as Sitchin puts it, cuneiform writing on clay tablets dating from about 1800 BC, tell the story of an advanced extraterrestrial race that came to Earth, found an indigenous species, modified its DNA, and that the purpose of that genetic intervention by the Anunnaki was to turn humanity, the indigenous species, into a slave species. Right. Okay. Would you say that's a fair synopsis?
Absolutely. That is the best summary. Yes.
Okay. Now, I think, Mel, that we'd probably have to dedicate another entire interview to this subject, but I'm going to give you my best shot. Okay? Just for now. When you read the Nag Hammadi documents, there's 52 of them, where I cull it down to 32 of them, because actually there's a lot of junk and confusion in them. They're really in bad shape. And so 32 of them are enough to get the essential picture. And I've written commentaries on the first 18 of these 32. When you look into these Nag Hammadi codices, you find that about 6 of them are cosmological documents. That is, they contain versions of the Gnostic cosmology and the Gnostic myth, how the planet Earth originated, how humanity originated, what produced the presence of certain alien predator-like beings in our solar system. This is explicitly explained. The Gnostic writings are the only texts that I have ever seen that explain the origin, nature, and intentions of this predatory alien species, which they call archons. And they describe 2 types of archons, a reptilian type and what I call a neonate or embryonic type, that is, would resemble the gray aliens insofar as they resemble a prematurely born fetus, right? They look like a human body looks if it's born prematurely.
Sure.
Both of these types are indicated in the Gnostic cosmological writings and in the story of the history of our planet. And the amazing thing also is that some of the Gnostic cosmological texts, such as On the Origin of the World or The Reality of the Archons, you find them in my website with my commentaries. Some of these texts describe the same incidents that are described in the Sumerian cuneiform record, but they describe them in a completely different way. Give you one example. It is widely claimed by David Icke and other people who are pushing Sitchin's material, who are putting forth, I should say, the Sumerian script as if it is a true story of ancient times. It is claimed by those people that two of these Anunnaki, Enki and his half-sister, genetically mingled their genes with human genes. Okay? Well, in the Gnostic version, it says that the archons, which I would identify as the Anunnaki, I make that identification, what are called the archons in the Gnostic materials are the same as the Anunnaki in the Sumerian. Okay? Mm-hmm. The Gnostic materials say, and get this, this is truly amazing. Oh, well, they tried, but they couldn't do it. They tried to interfere. They tried to interbreed, but they couldn't do it. It failed. Now, that is an amazing statement. And you asked me what I think of Sitchin. I read Sitchin as long as he was written, and I've discussed him and talked about his work with many, many people. Basically, I would say this. Just because something is written in cuneiform on clay tablets 3,800 years ago, doesn't mean it's true. Just because it's written doesn't mean it's a true account of what actually happened. And I don't believe it is. In fact, I believe that the whole Sumerian story of the Anunnaki creating humanity as a slave species is a disinformation scam.
That was my next question. If you thought it was a disinformation...
It's an ancient disinformation scam, and I can tell you exactly why that scam, why I believe that is a scam, who introduced that scam, and why they introduced that scam. And I've studied this very, very closely. But I want to say, before I go into those points, that if I speak with any confidence at all about this, and this is a really important subject, my friend, this is really big, and if I speak with any kind of confidence, not authority, because I'm not imposing my view, it's because I've really got the clue from the Gnostic materials. The Gnostic materials critique the Sumerian Sitchin story and tell you what's not true about it. Now, how could that be? How could it be that we would have some information from this ancient source, information coming from people who are much closer to that story than we are? The Gnostics were from the Levant. The core of the Gnostic groups were from the Middle East and from Syria and Iran and Iraq. And they had been in those countries for thousands of years. The Gnostic movement goes back to about 6,000 BC. And isn't it interesting that from those people who were experts in evolutionary history, who were shamans and seers, who studied the prehistory of the earth in teams of people over many generations, they were experts, that they would turn around and say, watch out, because this story is a lie. They tried to interfere with our genetic evolution, but they could not. We are not slaves because we were genetically manipulated to be. We're slaves because we're stupid. That's what a Gnostic would say. Gnostic would say that you have in yourself, you are not divine. Your ego is not divine. Even yourself is not divine. But every human being has a germ, a seed of divinity, and that is called nous. Your intelligence is divine. The intelligence of humanity is a divine faculty planted in us. This is a Gnostic teaching. And they would say, there is no evil. There are predators and mind parasites who interfere and try to insinuate themselves into the human mind. They do exist. But there is basically no evil in the cosmos, and we are not slaves except by our own doing, by enslaving ourselves, because we do not develop that germ of divine intelligence. This is the message of Gnosticism, and it bears very, very closely on the claims that are being so widely made based on Sitchin's work. So I think that Gnosticism really is worth looking into here, because it gives us a platform and an ability to critique the Sumerian Sitchin story.
And I thought that you were going to discuss the archons in the future, but I'm glad you brought the subject up.
In this context, I think it would, they deserve a separate treatment. But in this context, I felt it necessary to bring them up because I have made the connection that the Anunnaki, which many, many people know about, are the archons, and not many people know about the archons.
No, they don't. And by the way, I like how you have a glossary in your book, not in his image, and you define archons, just for the audience, from the Greek for first, from the beginning, inorganic species produced by the impact of Sophia or Sophia upon elementary matter before Sophia turned into the earth. Cyborgs inhabiting the solar system at large who excel in the psychotechnology of virtual reality, intrude upon humanity by psychic stealth, and propagate the ideological virus of redemptive religion. Entraps intrapsychic forces that exaggerate human error beyond the scale of correction. Or as Jack Valet would say, messengers of deception.
Messengers of deception. They are messengers of deception. This disinformation scam is not difficult to understand, actually. I'd like to just take a moment to try to explain that, if I might, because I know that many of your listeners have heard about the Anunnaki scenario. And, this Anunnaki scenario, largely through David Icke, is getting more and more. It's getting massive exposure. It's getting to the point where it's going to be competing with, conventional religions. It's really getting big. And so I'd like to explain as briefly as I can why I consider it to be a disinformation scam. When theocracy arose in the Middle East, in ancient Babylon, in the Fertile Crescent, around 4000 BC, it was a system of social organization that came along with agriculture. With agriculture and with organized agriculture, city-states arose. With city-states, you needed the organization of society. And also with agriculture, you had surplus goods. So trade arose. People had more grain than they could use. They were no longer simply bartering with their neighbors. And in this whole complex development, theocracy arose as a form of social control, social organization. But the first theocrats, if they were going to impose their authority on these up-and-coming cities, on the first urban centers, how were they going to do that? What was going to be the basis of their authority in the new societies, the new urban societies that were emerging, also in Egypt? Well, it's well known, and many historians point this out, that rulers in the ancient Middle East always had advisors who were called Chaldeans, usually. And the word Chaldean in ancient history meant a soothsayer, which means in our time a psychic or a channeler. I don't know if you've heard this fact, Mel, but Ronald Reagan was guided by an astrologer.
Yes.
Did you know that?
Yes, through his wife.
Yeah, his wife, Nancy, had an astrologer. And this astrologer, for instance, told Ronald Reagan the exact time of day and the exact day when he should meet with Gorbachev to discuss blah, blah, blah. Okay? So imagine that the people in the White House are being advised by astrologers, but not only by astrologers, but also by psychics, by channelers. Imagine Ramtha is in the White House giving advice to the president and his cabinet. Okay? This is maybe not such a wild idea. Who knows? But in ancient theocracies, this was absolutely the case. Because in fact, the men who were attracted to power in those times didn't really know how to rule society. It was a new game, and they didn't know how to impose their authority, so they relied on astrologers, soothsayers, and channelers. I'm not making this up. This is a well-known historical fact. Well, what did the channeler sitting in the court before the Babylonian king, what did the channeler tell the king? The channeler goes into a trance, just like channelers today. And the channeler has a job to fulfill. The psychic or channeler, in order to keep his or her position in the king of the court, needs to deliver to the king a message that the king is going to like. Well, what better message to give him than to say that he is a special progeny, not like other human beings, but he's actually the result of generation by the gods. He can claim that his ancestors were gods, and that gives him the right to rule. So this whole scenario of the Anunnaki gods interbreeding with humanity is simply a way to legitimate theocracy. It's a made-up story to legitimate theocracy and to give those early rulers a power of authority that could not be questioned. I would say, we are the descendants of the Anunnaki. First, the Anunnaki was here, but they're gone now. That's the whole thing. Why did they go? Where did they go? When did they go? You know, none of this is really clear. Sitchin is not really clear about that. I believe that at one point he mentions a date about when the Anunnaki departed the earth or something. But basically, the story that he's working with, that was written down on these cuneiform tablets, is a channeled, I believe it is a channeled information that was fed to the theocrats of that time to feed their egos and to legitimate their rulership over the emerging urban societies. And I think that if we uncritically today buy that story, we are in fact placing ourselves into the scenario of enslavement. We are writing a script that makes us slaves. And I don't believe that that script is true. We're not slaves of any extraterrestrial species. And it has never been proven, nor can it be proven, that anyone messed with our DNA, because in order to prove that scientifically, we would have to have a pre-intervention DNA to
before
compare.
And after, right.
That's right. So it's an unprovable hypothesis. And people who think like Kerner and other people, Nigel Kerner and other people who think that they can see in our DNA the proof of this intervention are really fooling themselves. It is an unprovable proposition. And it's also a proposition that's very, very dangerous. Because if we believe this story, considering the power of imagination of our species, which is something the Gnostics talked about a lot, if we believe this story, we could end up fulfilling this story simply because we believe in it. Do you understand what I mean?
Sure.
We could end up enslaving ourselves because we buy this story and we make it into our reality. So this is a real deal breaker. Where are we going to go with this Anunnaki script? And I would suggest to everyone who has heard about this Anunnaki story and has been fascinated by it, one way or another, before you make up your mind, read what I say about it in my book and read the Gnostic critique of the Anunnaki story. Read their version of what they said happened. Read their version. The Gnostic texts are the only surviving writings from the ancient past that assert that the alien predators, these archons, are liars. They rule by deception. They use hoax and fraud, and we actually have power over them, not them over us.